We are very happy to have Lauren Goodspeed here. She's a lecturer in the Department of French and Italian, and she's the coordinator of French 102, 1022, and 103. So we've got a lot of stuff going on. And she is going to be talking about exploring the meaning-making choices of collegiate French learners through genre-based writing. If you can welcome Lauren at this point.
Hi everyone. First I just want to say thank you to Carla for inviting me to give this presentation. It's a really exciting opportunity for me, and thank you all for being here. Before I get into the meat of everything, I just wanted to give you a brief overview of what I'll talk about today. So I'll start by giving you some background on kind of the state of affairs in foreign language writing instruction in the US in particular. And then I'll talk about a couple pedagogical models for writing instruction in foreign languages. And I will talk about the study that I did for my dissertation, or at least a part of it. I'll explain the research question that I'm focusing on for this talk today, tell you a little bit about my methodology, and then go through some of the key findings and conclusions for this particular research question. On the whole, writing instruction, especially at the lower levels in foreign languages, tends to be characterized by a strong focus on surface-level features of writing, such as spelling, syntax, usage, and perhaps word choice in some cases. Foreign language assignments are often designed to elicit targeted forms, and they are corrected and evaluated according to accurate use of those forms. Oops, sorry. There we go. In her 2009 ethnographic study of Spanish instructor perspectives on writing instruction, Lefkowitz found that half of her participants saw writing as a means for reinforcing accurate vocabulary and grammar, wielding the dreaded red pen as a means of seeking and destroying errors. The rise of process instruction in the 1990s, which focused on the use of multiple drafts to provide opportunities for revision and scaffold the cognitive process of writing, did change the face of writing instruction to a certain extent. So there are a few reasons that we've seen this focus on product instruction, even through an uptake of process approaches, and many scholars have written about them. One reason that people have brought up is a lack of professional development for foreign language instructors who may not ever have explicit instruction on how to teach writing. And also, teacher beliefs about L2 writing. Sometimes teachers believe that first language writing abilities automatically transfer to the second language, and so there's really no need to teach writing because it's just about using language correctly and accurately, and that will automatically create beautiful second language texts. However, we all know that this isn't really true. If you've ever received an email from a student, for example, who sends you a one-liner saying they won't be able to come to class today, no subject, no greeting, no closing, you know that genre conventions are very important. So even if they're using language accurately, it's maybe not a successful message. In terms of second language writing, Hyland has noted that successful first language writing doesn't necessarily transfer automatically into successful second language writing. Kern and have also written about the cognitive and sociocultural dimensions of writing in addition to the linguistic dimension. All three of these dimensions are part of our available designs or background knowledge for writing. When writing, we draw on all of the tools in our metaphorical toolbox to make meaning in our texts. This toolbox consists of all of our available designs. This includes linguistic resources such as our knowledge of vocabulary, grammar, and syntax, cognitive resources of how to carry out a writing task, planning, drafting, revising, generating ideas for textual content, and also sociocultural resources, which include culture-specific genre conventions, knowing how to meet reader expectations, knowing how reader-writer relationships are created through writing and being able to manipulate those relationships, And we need to frame writing instruction in ways that help to develop all three of these dimensions of writing rather than simply focusing on the linguistic dimension. Next, I'd like to introduce two pedagogical models that can be used to address all three of these dimensions. In the multiliteracies framework, writing instruction is closely aligned with the design metaphor that's illustrated here. When learners write, they draw on all of their available designs, all of those linguistic, cognitive, and sociocultural resources that they have in their toolbox. As learners engage in writing, they are designing or making meaning using those tools. The result of the act of designing is the redesigned. Learners transform not only the tools they gain from model text by putting them into new contexts and ascribing new meanings, but they also transform their own available designs through this process by gaining new resources for meaning making in the future. This figure here illustrates a simplified cycle of genre-based instruction, which has some overlap with multiliteracies and the design metaphor. This cycle is based on Rothery's work published in 1996. She has done a lot of work on the implementation of genre-based pedagogies, and it's also adapted slightly using a multiliteracies lens. So the first stage of instruction here in genre familiarization, learners are introduced to the model text and content of that text. They're also introduced to the context and audience of that potential text, and general comprehension of the text is established. In stage 2, learners are guided through an analysis of the genre's key features, including language features, content, organization, everything that they need to know to reproduce that genre. In this pre-writing stage, learners use the model text to help them plan their writing, and they draw on features that they analyze during the second stage, genre analysis. Eventually, learners get to the writing stage where they put all of their ideas into a completed text, and this may also include the use of multiple drafts, as we saw in process instruction, and reflections on learning after having completed a draft. There are a few commonalities between the design metaphor that we saw before and the cycle of genre instruction. So during the genre familiarization and analysis stages, learners are designing or interpreting meaning from the text that they're reading, and they're developing new available designs to be able to help them with their writing in the future. They then concretize those available designs during the pre-writing stage, and they transform their available designs during writing when they're designing their own text, and the product of their work is the redesigned, as well as themselves. They're also redesigned by having gained new available designs. Despite the promise that genre-based pedagogy offers for weaving together the three dimensions of writing and instruction, it has seen very limited uptake in foreign language programs in the United States, in collegiate foreign language programs. Research on genre pedagogy in U.S. foreign language instruction has been mostly confined to work coming out of the Georgetown German department, where they've often focused on advanced language development and genre pedagogy. So they've written a lot about implementation of genre pedagogy because genre is used as a framework for their entire foreign language program. And they've also done a lot of the research on how learners develop more advanced language through the use of genre pedagogy, but really just looking at the way learners' language develops in their own curriculum as opposed to how learners' language develops based on what they're reading during genre pedagogy. So studies that have focused on more of the reading-writing connections include work that I have done with Heather Allen, work that Hiram Maxim has done, and work that Kate Paisani has done. Heather and I focused on learner uptake of different features of a manifesto letter in a fifth semester French class. Maxim focused on advanced level German students and looked at their uptake of different features from model text across 4 different genre-based tasks. And Kate Paisani looked at how learners take up linguistic versus schematic available designs from model texts. Only one study, to my knowledge, focuses on how novice-level learners develop available designs in genre-based pedagogy. This was Yasuda's study, which was done in an EFL context in Japan, which is a little difficult to compare with a foreign language context in the United States because it's a very different learner population with different motivations, and the relative prestige of the language in both contexts could be very different. It is especially important to understand how novice-level learners engage with this pedagogy because it is a framework that can be used across the entire curriculum. So this is a framework that helps to bridge the Langlet divide, this focus on language in the lower levels of instruction and a focus on content in the upper levels of instruction. This can be used across the entire curriculum. So to move into my study a little bit, one of the primary research questions that I explored in my dissertation was how beginning French learners, collegiate French learners, were taking up resources from model text to design meaning. And meaning design, as you saw, is a pretty complex concept, so I broke it down into just two component parts. I looked at what features students were taking up from the model text that they read, including specific vocabulary items, conventional expressions, ideas for content, organizational patterns, even formatting of a text. And I also looked at what reasons they used particular features. Today, I am focusing on just the second part of this question, the reasons for borrowing particular features or using particular features. Because I think that it provides a lot of insight into the multiple dimensions of literacy that writers were attending to when they were making choices about which features to use. So data for my study were collected from 25 learners in 2 sections of a first semester French class and 2 sections of a second semester French course at a large Midwestern university. Both courses had very similar goals, they had similar assessment plans, and they both implemented genre-based writing projects at the end of 2 units as summative assessments out of 5 of the total units that they covered. The main data sources that were analyzed for this particular question were text-based interviews that I conducted with participants at the end of each of their projects. So after they wrote their project, I would interview them about the process that they went through when writing their text, how they used the model text when they were writing, their impressions of their text, and things like that. I also drew on the first drafts that students wrote. In the first semester, the 2 projects that they completed were a roommate ad and a cover letter. While in the second semester, the projects that they completed were a reflective travel recount and an informational interview. So this informational interview was meant to inform an exchange student coming to the university about life in this university town. Lastly, while it was not a key data source that I analyzed for this question, I just wanted to note that I did do classroom observations because I wanted to understand how the pedagogy was being implemented and how that might affect learners' uptake of particular features in their own texts. I took a qualitative approach to analysis using multiple cycles of coding and memoing to develop themes related to the reasons learners used model text resources. So moving into the findings, the table that you see here is a summary of how I categorize learners' reasons for using resources from the model text. And I situated my analysis within those 3 dimensions that we talked about that Kern and Husser mentioned, the linguistic, the cognitive, and the sociocultural dimensions, to try to understand what the reasons that learners gave for using model text features related to most in terms of literacy. It's important to note, however, that the linguistic, cognitive, and sociocultural dimensions of writing and literacy are very much interconnected, and so it's very difficult to try to separate them out. So even though these are categorized into the 3 different dimensions, they don't necessarily only represent that one dimension because it is so fluid and interconnected. The numbers in the table that you see too are the number of learners who at least once mentioned having used or having the reason related most to one of these dimensions. So, for example, 14 learners who wrote the recount said that they used something for a linguistic purpose, if that makes sense, hopefully. Overall, you can see that most learners reference themes related to the linguistic or sociocultural dimensions of writing, no matter the task. Learners in general were less inclined to reference the cognitive dimension of writing, but interestingly, learners tended to reference the cognitive dimension of writing more for the first task that they completed than the second. So that's the roommate ad and the recount for first versus second semester. In the next slides, I'll break down each of these themes into sub-themes so you can see what exactly it meant to use a resource within the linguistic dimension or the cognitive dimension. And I'll show you some illustrative quotes. And I just would like to remind you that this is out of 25 total participants. So within the linguistic dimension, the most prominent reason learners used model text resources was to meet their communicative needs. Wei and Paula were two of my participants. They're both second semester learners, and they explained that they used specific expressions and vocabulary for their reflective travel recount because those linguistic resources just matched their own experiences. So what was written about in the model text happened to fit very well for them as well. In other cases, learners use language that helped them to realize a particular communicative function, like Lei, a first semester learner, who wanted to discuss her housing budget, but didn't have the resources to be able to do that. Learners also used model text resources to overcome linguistic roadblocks. As you see in Greg's explanation here of how he used the model text to write his roommate ad, if he had the linguistic resources to express his ideas in French, he says, I would just say it. If he didn't know what to say, that's when he would go to the text. He goes on to say, I just plug that in, meaning the language from the model text, and then go about my way until I hit another roadblock. In his explanation, we can see how Greg used the model text to scaffold the meaning-making process by providing him with additional linguistic resources for writing in French. Lastly, some learners used vocabulary or expressions that were new to them, such as Nellie, who closed her roommate ad with "à très vite," or "see you very soon," likely to learn additional expressions that were not introduced through the textbook or in class. Within the cognitive dimension of writing, learners took up resources that they could most easily understand and those that helped them overcome content roadblocks. In relation to understanding resources, learners sometimes chose which resources to use simply based on what they understood in the model text. In cases where learners had a limited understanding of the model text, it seriously constrained their ability to use resources from the model text. If you can't understand something, then you probably can't use it, and you definitely cannot adapt it for your own purposes. For other learners, they used their understanding to mediate the resources they used, drawing on what they were most readily able to incorporate into their own available designs. This resulted in learners attending to those resources that were most appropriate for their development in French. Learners also used resources to overcome content roadblocks like they did with linguistic roadblocks. This was particularly common in second semester with the second semester French students, where the genres that they were producing were much less formulaic and probably less familiar to them than something like a roommate ad or a cover letter. As Paige mentioned in the quote that you see here, if she was lost or if she couldn't think of something to say, she would go back to the model text and that would help her to come up with an idea. In other words, the model text didn't just provide learners with linguistic resources, but it also helped them generate ideas for content that they wanted to talk about in their texts. The model text then provided learners with cognitive resources for appropriate textual content for the particular genre that they were writing. Within the sociocultural dimension, all of the sub-themes here related to how learners wanted to be perceived by their readers or how they wanted to portray themselves as writer. All but one participant made reference to using the model text as a resource to help them meet their readers' expectations. While some learners referred to the project requirements and incorporated model text features they thought their instructors wanted to see, others actually imagined a potential reader, a real-life reader of their text, such as a potential roommate in France, a study abroad company hiring director, or a francophone student coming to study in the US. Serena, for example, described herself in her roommate ad as a nice and easygoing person by using adjectives that she had found in the model text. On one hand, her explanation points to how she thinks her imagined reader might interpret her text, and on the other hand, it demonstrates her awareness of the conventional descriptions used in roommate ads based on her reading of the 3 model texts. Not only was Serena meeting reader expectations by using these terms, but she was also meeting conventions for the genre. Learners also drew on resources that helped them to enhance the readability of their text by taking out organizational elements and transitions to make their text sound more fluid, is what they said. They drew on new vocabulary items to add more variety to their texts. And they also drew on structures that they thought made their text sound more complex or more sophisticated, sometimes they said. Specific references learners made to wanting to have a certain effect on the reader were coded with creating reader-writer relationships. Comments about the reader were particularly common among first semester learners who needed to establish very different kinds of relationships with their readers in a roommate ad versus a cover letter. At the same time, second semester learners also drew on model text in order to manipulate these relationships. Julia, for example, incorporated the idea and the syntax of a particular type of playful side comment that was made in the informational interview because she thought it made her text more personal. She said it was kind of fun and allowed her to communicate information in a funny way. Drawing on this resource from the model text allowed Julia to infuse her text with personality and style and allowed her to create a friendly, informal relationship with her reader. Lastly, some learners used resources they felt reflected their voice as a writer. One example of this was how Macy incorporated emojis into her roommate ad because she felt that they reflected her voice. And Wei also drew on a particular vocabulary term that had a personal cultural meaning for him in his informational interview. In a way, the model text was helping learners to figure out how to render their first language voice in French, or at least start to think about style in French and how they might develop their personal style.
Overall, I think that these findings point to some important conclusions in terms of foreign language learners' literacy development. First of all, these findings demonstrate that novice-level foreign language writers are entirely capable of thinking about text in a multidimensional way. Even when learners are drawing on specific language features of model text, they're thinking about how these resources relate to the cognitive dimension and sociocultural dimension of writing. Just as Serena did when she chose language based on its prevalence in the text that she was reading, and thinking about the way that she wanted to be seen by the reader of her roommate ad. The different reasons for which learners used linguistic resources also points to their development of the ability to make form-meaning connections, which is an important aspect of literacy development and language learning. Learners were able to develop some understanding of how language choices relate to broader aspects of meaning making, such as readability, expected content, and register. Lastly, I want to highlight this idea of the redesigned and how it relates to the implementation of genre pedagogy in this particular context. Genre pedagogy sometimes gets a bad rap for being too formulaic or prescriptive, but what I saw in what learners were doing and in these results was that learners were being highly intentional about the choices that they were making and the resources that they were using from model text, and they were being very reflective about it as well. And this resulted in highly individualized text, so not everyone's text looked like everyone else's text. To return to the concept of meaning design, learners remixed and redesigned resources from the model text and they redesigned their own tools for future instances of meaning making. Overall, I think that these findings point to promising evidence for the viability of genre-based pedagogy across the curriculum. So we see that even at the lowest levels of instruction, learners are developing sort of this multidimensional understanding of writing. And it also points to the contributions that genre-based pedagogy can make to foreign language learners' literacy development. And with that, I'm happy to take comments or questions.
I have a couple questions. I'll start with one and then I can come back to the second one. I'm much more familiar with oral proficiency and oral language acquisition than written. And so I noticed at one point when you were giving the example in the linguistics section about the girl who used a specific phrase to say, see you soon, or whatnot, and you mentioned that you felt that she had learned that phrase. And I was wondering how in written studies, and I don't mean to be nitpicking on that term, but are there ever post-tests in genre pedagogy to see, down the line who actually learned this in their writing, or are you just able to do it once?
Sure, this is a really good question, and it's something I'm very interested in. So for my dissertation study, I did collect kind of like a pseudo post-test. After they did their genre-based projects, the writing that they did on the exams had a similar kind of vibe. So I was curious to see if they would bring those resources into what they wrote on the exams. However, I have not analyzed that data, and honestly, I don't think it really panned out. And I don't mean to say that she learned that expression by having used it in her text. At least not in the sense that she is definitely going to be able to use it in all future instances of meaning making. I think her intention was to learn a new expression. So that was really like what she wanted to get out of it. And I would think that even if she's not able to produce it in the future, she might recognize it and understand it. So I hope that responds to your question. And you had a second question too.
If other people don't. Okay, my other question was in that same area around the linguistic resources and how you mentioned that it gives them other opportunities or like to make meaning, or I forget how you phrased it, but to reach meaning that they wanted to make. And I was wondering if you saw any examples where it constrained them and that they only made the meaning that they sought from the text. Does that make sense? Yeah,
that is a really good question. Definitely, I don't have an exact answer to that specific question, but definitely some learners did feel somewhat constrained by the model text and frustrated when they weren't able to just say whatever they wanted to say. So it's kind of like, I don't know, maybe a double bind situation where it did give them more resources than what they already had from just the textbook and classroom instruction, but they did feel just generally constrained. And I think it was just, lack of language development as opposed to genre pedagogy itself. Yeah.
A couple questions too. How many examples of a particular genre type were they exposed to?
So for the roommate ad, they had 3, which was good. For all of the others, they only had 1, which was not ideal, not recommended for genre pedagogy.
So that's part of that constraint.
Definitely, yeah, and I think especially that came out in the second semester cohort that was a challenge because those 2 genres were so, you can't even really call them genres, they were text types, and they weren't really anything formulaic that students would have been exposed to before. So that was definitely a weakness of the way it was implemented.
The other question has to do with writing as a process.
Yeah.
It's, you talk about exposure to speaking, which is a much more kind of a extemporaneous sort of thing. Whereas writing, we have recourse to all sorts of resources that we wouldn't have when speaking.
Right.
How does that concept fit into kind of genre pedagogy? I mean, again, in that sense of, if I have 5 examples of a particular genre type, I might use those as resources. opposed to trying to just do something online.
So I'm trying to understand what you're getting at here.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time. So, all right, let's put it in context. I mean, very often, if you're going to do a test of writing, we give them a test of writing with no recourse to any resources, right? That's not how we write.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, so I think the idea behind this is making writing a little bit more like we write. So, I mean, most of us, when we're writing a new genre for the first time, will go look for examples online or like look up advice about, okay, how do I structure this thing? How do I write a grant proposal? You know, like I've never seen one before, or I've never seen a dissertation, so let me look at some examples. Yeah, it's really trying to build learners available designs in terms of language, in terms of structure, in terms of conventional features, so that they're able to analyze text that way in the future. It's really developing a critical thinking skill and an analysis skill that is not often seen in writing instruction in foreign language programs.
So just a quick follow-up, sorry. How would that play out then in assessment of writing?
These were assessments. So, I mean, these were summative assessments, end of chapter. So they were related to the themes that were being developed in each of the units. And then this was a summative assessment. It still saw multiple drafts. So I looked at their first versions, but then they also had a correction code and wrote a second version. But yeah, they were assessments.
So I'm glad you asked the question about how many models were available, because I think that's
an important question.
Really important question.
Yes.
Because when you go on in a sequence of teaching writing, it's almost always based on genre writing. I teach poetry, and there's always a moment when I ask them to write a poem, right? But it's after they've had 6 weeks of nothing but poetry.
Looking at poems.
Right? And it's a very similar, actually, it's a very similar model in a certain way, right? My question actually goes back to something you said at the very beginning, and that is that one of the big barriers to changing how we think about writing in foreign language classrooms is actually teacher training and teacher awareness about this. So I'm wondering, two things I noticed in your presentation. First of all, you didn't talk about how instructors should be trained in a specific way for this, and are there barriers that you think are to this? And just, if you can just talk about those in just a couple of hours, I'm sure that's And then the other thing, and I feel like this is related, I'm not exactly sure how, but the other question I wanted to ask you is you talked a lot about the metacognitive dimensions of this exercise. And in part, you had access to the metacognitive dimensions because you were doing a study, right? But would you actually put those into genre teaching? Is that part of how you want students to be reflecting on their writing?
You mean like by the way I was asking students to explain their choices? Yeah. So I'll answer the second question first. And I think that reflection is a really useful part of writing to allow learners to kind of synthesize knowledge and figure out what are they learning from this task. So in these instances, they did do reflective writing on their drafts. And it's something that I've worked into any sorts of genre-based assessments that I've done with my students, is asking them to reflect on how they use the model text, how did it help them in knowing how to create their text. So I do think that reflection step is really important. You look unsatisfied.
Well, I'm not unsatisfied. I feel like there's a box missing on one of your processes, because that's also part of the sociocultural dimension. Trying to respond to this outside authority who's saying, I want you to do this. If there's a metacognitive step, then it's also a step where you're accounting for what you're doing, which is a really different way of thinking about learning than others. Do you see what? So, and that seems like that's part of something that is what you call the redesigned. So it seems like that's really important.
Yeah, and I did say that reflection could be an element of the writing step. So I did say that. It's not conventionally associated with genre-based pedagogy, but it's definitely, I think it's associated with multiliteracies for sure.
So my point is that I think it's in your study. That's a part of the model you're developing. So
the reflection piece is important. And then you were asking about teacher training, which is a whole can of worms. Yeah, I think it's really challenging. And even the instructors that were involved in this study were highly motivated, well-trained in literacy-based pedagogy, had been introduced to genre-based pedagogy. All of these are not trivial barriers either. And they really struggled implementing genre-based pedagogy. We had a lot of conversations. I mean, I helped them develop activities to use in class, but it's definitely a significant barrier. And I don't have a good response as to what to do about that, besides there just needs to be more teacher training. And I think even just starting with teacher training on what is writing, how do we teach writing, and bringing some awareness to that is a good first step. Yeah.
I have a follow-up to that then.
Yeah.
Did you have any sort of feedback from those instructors then after this, I think it was probably an experimental phase, of what was their reaction to the process and their reaction to the results they got from their students in the writing?
Well, there was a simultaneous study being conducted by Heather Willis-Allen and Kate Paisani on teachers and how they were learning to implement genre pedagogy. So stay tuned and ask them.
I noticed she's suspiciously absent.
Enjoying some warm weather in San Francisco.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's the difference here between genre and text time? Because I feel like genre is something that you can transfer from one language to another more than text type. And then reading text type, I think I'm thinking about myself, for example, when I have to write an email, apologizing for something in English. So for example, when I play just an abstract or a conference, or when I have to email a professor to change a date, right? And I feel really comfortable in English, and I've been studying English for a really long time, but still I always look at models. I type and I Google, apologizing to professor. I just copy that, and then I change a couple things. And then I'm really sure that that is really key, because that, I would just say, it's a different genre, right? It's like a different thing.
Yeah.
But I don't know if professors, I don't know if I was an English teacher, I don't think I would be able to teach that.
So genre and text type, I tend to use somewhat interchangeably. Genre technically is a larger category than text type, and people have talked about macro genres, so like a narrative genre, expository, recount, things like that. But I kind of use genre interchangeably with text types within those categories, because different text types can involve different pieces of macro genres. So yeah, and I would say that all of these were text types more than genres, but I use genre because I'm talking about genre-based pedagogy. Yeah. But really it was more focused on particular text types. Yeah. Yeah.
So I wondered if you could talk about any insights you have on why the cognitive dimension was lower and why there was a pattern. I'm just curious if you have any sense as to why that is. And then the second question is related to selecting texts, which seems like if you're going to be doing a genre-based pedagogical approach, that would
really
be
important.
A huge, it would be a very important, and it should be a thoughtful piece.
Absolutely.
And I wonder if you have any, guidelines, or, if you could speculate on what would be barriers to that.
Yes. Okay. So hold on. Tell me. Oh, cognitive dimension was your first question. Okay. So about the pattern that we saw with the first text was the one that they tended to bring up the cognitive dimension more. I have no idea why that would be. But in general, I think the reason why we saw less about the cognitive dimension was perhaps because it was a reflection after the fact, and it wasn't necessarily the focus of what I was asking them to talk about. Most of the time when the cognitive dimension came up, it was at the beginning of the interview when I was asking them about their process for writing. Other than that, I had asked learners to highlight anything that they used from the model text, and that is another reason that maybe the cognitive dimension didn't come up so much, because I was looking at more, I guess, narrow uses of the model text. So sometimes it came up in conversation, but it might not have been learners' focus based on the experimental design. Yeah, and then your second question was about
The selecting a text.
selecting a text, yes. Definitely not trivial, definitely very important. And the way that we selected text was first looking at what is a reasonable text to use as a formative or a summative assessment based on what we've covered so far in this unit. And then we were also thinking about a generic continuum. So in systemic functional linguistics, there's this generic continuum in terms of the advancedness of language required for different types of genres. And so we were trying to stage the text that we chose along that continuum, which, yeah.
So, you said for one of the chapters they had 3 texts, and then the others they just had 1. So for the summative assessment, did they have access to all 3 of those and access to
Yeah.
the ones? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, they had the model, the model texts were analyzed in class over 2 days. They did pre-writing in class, and then they took their model text, their pre-writing, everything home, and they did their writing at home and turned it in. So, yeah. Yep.
Oh, I was thinking as you were responding to the first question on the cognitive dimension, connecting with your question as well. I work in K-12, and we talk a lot about teaching learning strategies, and what you're describing is so important for what we're teaching young learners, but I think at the collegiate level, we also assume that our students have these learning strategies, and they already know how to use a text as a model, and so it seems like this pedagogy also is a great opportunity to explicitly teach them the strategies that we're assuming that the students are.
Absolutely. And that's one of the really powerful things about genre pedagogy, is it kind of removes this assumption that everyone knows how to write the type of text that I'm going to ask them to write, and it gives everyone the same resources and the same access to the information about how to write this particular text type. Yeah, absolutely. Very much so.
It's so funny you mention that, because I have seen this. I have a 9-year-old daughter who is learning genre-based writing in English.
Yeah.
Right? And what I think is so interesting is she's got a lot of second language, non-native speakers of English in her class. Not a lot, but a certain amount. And they're all doing the same thing.
Yes.
Right?
This is
and that's
widely
exactly
used.
What you're saying. But it was fascinating because I saw direct applicability to my classroom, but I didn't think about it as genre.
Yeah, no, this is widely used in both ESL and first language composition classes, genre-based pedagogy. It just has not seen so much uptake in foreign languages. Yeah.
And the question about the text, did you find authentic texts?
Yes, these were authentic texts.
And you were able to find them for the first semester level
Yep.
that didn't have too much language?
Yes, yep, yeah. I think we did a tiny bit of glossing for a couple of the texts, but mostly authentic texts with no glossing. Yep, yeah. Yeah.
When you talk about authentic text, so a text, is it authentic if you take it out of the context where it was created?
That is such a good question and something I think about frequently. Sometimes, yeah. I mean, like the first tasks that the first semester learners did, the roommate ad, those were from a Facebook group that I just screenshotted and we put into a Word document. So you do lose the context of, all of the numerous roommate ads that are in this entire feed of of ads and, like other things like the advertisements that are popping up on the sides and images and blah, blah, blah. So it definitely does change the experience of how learners interact with the text.
But then what if instead of language, instead of learning civilization, I don't know that much about pedagogy, but we can talk about authentic text. That's how
That's true with any genre.
Yeah.
Again, I usually teach more advanced learners, right?
Yeah.
And that's true. You take a poem out, you're not putting it
Right.
in the context of its collection.
Yeah.
You take a play, you're not putting it in the context of its performance.
Right.
So
And-
that's just a basic.
Yeah.
That's almost a feature of genre in that you can't actually situate it in its total and complete context.
Right. Well, you can, but it's very challenging. And it's one of the important pieces of the genre familiarization stage too, is kind of familiarizing learners and telling them about the context where these texts are coming from so that they understand what its purpose is, who the audience might be, and things like that.
So it's basically an authentic text in
We would refer to it as an authentic text because it is written for the target language audience. It wasn't written for learners. Yeah.
So couldn't you extrapolate from this a different approach to the teaching of oral?
Yes.
Teaching of language?
Yeah, and so actually these students, I said 2 of their summative assessments were written genre-based projects. The other 2 were oral genre-based projects. So yes, absolutely. Yep. Yeah.
But thank you very much. It's obviously generated a lot of conversation, so thank you so much.
Thank you.